One. All right, friends, welcome. It is week two, Python. I don't know why I couldn't put the little snake today. I don't know why it wasn't working. So sorry about that. But it is week two, Monday. It is our lecture one of week two. It is August 9th, 2021. Just wanted to say welcome. I hope that the first week of Python was not too bad for you and actually was something that you really enjoyed and really want to do forever for the rest of your life because it is awesome. Couple things for us. Discussion posts. You guys have been doing incredible at this. You guys did very well this week. There's just a couple people that forgot to do discussion posts. Now, one thing I do want to point out is if you are retaking this course, you do still have to resubmit discussion posts. Because it's a new course and everything restarted, I'm showing zeros for that. So if you are retaking, if you've already taken Python before, it still might show on the platform that there is like 100% that you answered it. But if you you would know if you haven't done it within just this cohort, you do need to resubmit that. That's with discussion posts and assignments. So please make sure that you do that. They are done. They are open and they are due by Sunday, August 15th. Obviously, that's the last day. There is no makeups. If you are having issues and you can't post, make sure that you reach out to me and let me know immediately. The biggest thing that people reach out to me and say is they try to use, instead of using this platform, they use this guy right here, this learning platform, our old one. You guys might not even have been students when this was a thing, but this is our old platform right here. So if it's white and it kind of looks all clinky, don't use this one. Your discussion posts will not work here. They do need to be on our new platform, on our good platform. So please make sure that you are using that one as well. And assignments wise, you've got two core assignments this week. Now, I do want you to know that this week and last week was two core assignments each week, right? Pretty simple. We didn't want to overload you. These next couple weeks, we're going to look at a sneak peek of this week and these next couple weeks, but these next couple weeks are pretty heavy. Just going to be super transparent with you. After this week, the learning kind of, the ramp kind of goes straight up. And so if you can, it would behoove you to do these and start working on next week. Start getting ahead, start doing and working ahead. It's going to help your understanding of the material. It's going to help you ask better questions during class. So please make sure that you do that. But this week you do have two core assignments, bank account and users with bank account. So please make sure that you do those by Sunday. Cool. A little sneak peek at this week. What we are talking about is OOP, object-oriented programming, and that's all we are talking about. That's everything we're talking about this week. We're going to be talking really today just about the beginning aspects of OOP. How do we create a class? What is this init guy? What are class attributes? When we're how do we reference like instance information? Creating an instance of a class, using self as a reference, and what self what implicit passages. And then we're also going to talk about methods today. We're going to really talk about just class methods. We might get into instance, class, and static methods. Sorry, we're going to talk about instance methods today. We might talk about class and static methods. If not, we're going to cover that on Wednesday. OOP is something that's really important, really kind of crucial. So we like to take our time. That's why we give ourselves an entire week instead of just like one day, because there's a lot to go through. Next class, what we're going to actually be talking about is the 4 pillars of OOP. So we're going to be talking about those. Anything that we didn't cover today in the sense of class/static methods. And then we are going to talk about chaining methods. So how do we have, if we have a class of user and a class of bank account, how do we have those interact? So that's going to be on Wednesday for us. And today's just going to be really the basics of OOP. Now, next week, we are starting on Flask. So next Monday is going to be our first Flask lecture. So make sure that you are moving forward and going into the Flask material. With that being said, this extras thing right here, don't worry about it. Right? If you're way ahead and you want to look at this for a day, go for it. But all of this information here is optional and not at all really a necessary thing for learning the material today, learning the material moving forward. You will go through linked lists, singly linked lists, and doubly linked lists. You're going to go through all those different data structures and projects and algorithms. So it does not matter. Bubble sort, cool. Sorting, cool. Again, going through that in projects and algorithms. This is something you can come back to. Has nothing to do with Flask. The only one I would say to look at is maybe ternary operators, but it's just a fancy way to say an if statement. That might take you 5 minutes to look at. Instead of saying an if else, you can just do this guy right here. But that's really the only one that might be useful for where we're going in this class for right now. All of this information is useful. I'm not saying just skip it forever, but what I am saying is if you already do the Python OOP stuff and you've already done the assignments, go ahead and start working on the Flask material. This is what we're going to be diving into on next week. And this is going to be super crucial to you understanding the course, understanding this little micro ORM or micro framework, and understanding how we can use these frameworks for Python. The next week, we are doing MySQL, which we're going to do some SQL queries. SQL language is its own thing, right? And so this is week 4. We're going to be doing those SQL queries. And then weeks 5 and 6, we're combining those together. Then week 6, we are starting our exam. So we are getting ready to start cruising. So just be prepared for that. Any questions on that material and kind of where we're going these next couple of weeks? Again, just looking at your assignment checklist. This week, you've got this bank account and users with bank accounts as your core assignments. Then next week in our Flask material, you have 4 core assignments. And the following week, you have 4 core assignments. You're learning new material very quickly. So again, work ahead if you can. Cool. Great. One thing I like to do, especially when you guys are starting a new language and when I'm teaching a new language, is I like to have something that sometimes I call it honesty hour, sometimes I call it honesty time. And what I really like to do is just check in for maybe 5 minutes and see how you guys are feeling. You guys are learning Python. Sometimes, not sometimes, often students get very overwhelmed with learning a new language and you just got comfortable with either HTML and CSS, and this is all very different. So what I like to do is just out of 5, can you guys put in the chat kind of how you're feeling with the material? 5 obviously being I'm crushing it. This is easy. This is good to go. I've already done all kinds of stuff. 1 being like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And the point of this is not to just say, oh my goodness, I'm crushing it or I'm not understanding anything. The point of it is this week is a little bit lighter in the sense of we're focusing on OOP, but you have lighter assignments. I'm seeing a couple 2s. I'm seeing a couple 4.5s, 4.9. What I like to ask is, so those people who put anything 3 or less, so 3 or less, can you just put something in the chat of maybe that you don't understand or that you are a little bit confused about? Because what I'll do is next office hour, I'll actually just talk about that, right? And I'll kind of build that up. Verbiage, syntax, how to even look for it. Okay. Syntax, do you mean like not declaring variable, or are you talking about like the code block in itself?
Like in the assignments we've had thus far, I know conceptually what to do more or less. I understand the logic.
Sure.
I have no idea where to even start typing, like what's supposed to go first,
Sure.
what terms to be able to use. And then I look it up online and I, go 2x the 20-minute rule on Google and otherwise, and I still can't come to a good conclusion because I barely know what to type in to be able to figure out the answer.
Yeah. Is there a specific assignment that looks like a couple people? And the other part of why I do this is sometimes you feel like you're the only one who doesn't understand something. And so by us collectively saying, hey, I'm not understanding this, or, I'm also struggling with that, kind of makes you be like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not going to fail as a developer. Other people are feeling this way. I'm not by myself. So that's why I do this. Is there a specific assignment? Is it like functions, intermediate 1? Is there a specific thing that you guys did that kind of is just very confusing?
I mean, I think, intermediate was a challenge.
Okay. So maybe what I'll do, what I'll do is, because it seems like a couple of people are saying that working through dictionaries and lists and how to navigate, that's a real thing, right? That's a hard thing to do. So what I'll do is functions intermediate 1, our core assignment from last week, this guy right here. I will go and I will do that in our office hour. If you can't make office hour, that's okay. But I'm going to walk through those and just kind of step by step how I would approach those. You'll obviously have the recording. I put every office hour recording on this sheet right here, just where the office hour is. So if you look at last week, we have the 2 office hours. Here's a for loop basics 1. I will put the office hour. It'll be right here on Wednesday, but I'll walk through that for you guys. That way you guys have just some additional information and how I would personally approach it. We did do that a little bit today in our office hour. We just did a challenge, like an algorithm, basically. So that might help you guys, seeing how we did pseudocode and how we kind of, break down the question before we even start coding, before we even start doing anything. So I'll put that office hour right there, but I will make sure that next office hour, I break down some of that stuff for you guys. And again, this is why I do this. That way I can kind of tailor my lectures to what you guys are needing help with, not necessarily with, that way I'm not just blind with what you're doing. Writing functions is a little bit tough. I hear that. I will say just with this is, especially if you're new to coding, this stuff will require practice, right? And so I'm happy to always walk through this and have one-on-ones with you guys, but practice will absolutely help you, right? Like it just will. Anybody that's developed for a while will tell you the same thing. So just, that's not me saying that you just need to practice more and be better. It's just me saying, on top of me helping explain it, practice will absolutely help you there as well. Cool. And for you guys that are 4.5, 4.9, way to go. That's awesome. Keep crushing it. Keep hitting it. And if you can, if anybody's asking questions, you guys are great in the Discord channel. Just keep helping people, because we are all, it's not a you versus another student. We're all collectively trying to be better. So way to go. That you guys have been doing awesome at that stuff. So way to go. Cool. All right. We are going to jump into object-oriented programming. Before I do that, is there any questions, housekeeping stuff, any requests, any things like that? Okay, sorry, I was just reading Peter's message. Okay, perfect. Well, then let's dive into object-oriented programming. Has anybody worked with object-oriented programming? Does anybody know, can like give me a definition of object-oriented programming, Wesley or Peter? What would be a definition? What could you say object-oriented programming is? Wesley or Peter, what would you say?
Yeah, it's in my mind, object-oriented programming is a way to organize your code into different objects specifically. Is the best way to put it. I always like to use the example of like people, right? Every person's an object, but like a student has different routines. So if you run the definition of routine, it would have different routines than a working adult or so much.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm playing this really poorly. I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. But you're right, right? It's a way that I guess from the fundamental standpoint, it is a very, very popular, very important way that we can set up applications to run. And what we basically do is we break different data into what we call objects, right? Object-oriented programming. And then we define how those objects interact with one another. So let's look at this, right? This is what we're doing here. We are talking about OOP. I'm here on the platform. And there's a great kind of example from gaming. Maybe you have like a farmer and a barbarian and, a Roman or something like that. Everybody, all the farmers are similar because they're all farmers, but there are different farmers, right? And barbarians and Romans. And so there's a way that we can kind of classify each person, but let's go kind of more in depth and go from a easier, not more in depth, sorry. Let's go from a little bit easier way and break down maybe why we would want to do object-oriented programming. Let's say I work for some company. I'm a CEO of some company, right? And I'm setting up, I finally get acquired, or I kind of create my product, and I need to get some employees. So as we did with lists last week, we showed, okay, well, we have this employee list, and that had like a name, an age, a favorite color, and food, right? And then we said, well, it's actually a little bit easier for me to create a dictionary. So let's say we do that. My employee's got a key of a first name. First name. Right? Let's say it is John. They've got a last name. John's last name. Just they were John last. Their age. I probably wouldn't need age. Let's say salary. And let's say their salary is 84,000. And let's say they do department. What department are they in? Let's say John is an engineer. Perfect. Cool. So I have created John, right? So if I want to say, oops, if I want to say something like print employee first name, and I run this. Python 3 main.py. It gives me John. Cool. Let's say I'm growing, I'm getting bigger as a company, and I have now an employee B. That is Susie. Name. It's got a salary of 89,000 and she is a manager. Perfect. Okay. Well, this is something I can do, right? I can do this. We've seen that I can kind of put this stuff in a dictionary, pretty simple, pretty easy, but I feel like I'm doing a lot of typing, right? Now, let's say I'm even growing even bigger. Now I have to have employee seat. It's got a first name of Joan, pizza. She is a data scientist. She gets paid a bunch of money. Perfect. And so I have all these different employees. Cool. And let's say that I was doing this, right? And this is how I was setting up my database. This is how I was setting up my application, right? With each employee, all I was doing is I was creating a dictionary. And every time I did that, I can just run this and I get all of their names. Now, let's say I do hire, we're getting super big. We are a company that people want to work at. And I get an intern, right? And all their entire job is to input data, right? So let's say they get a new employee and they are to do this. Let's say they are putting in data and they do something like this. Jax. Their last name is Smith. And their salary is, I don't know, it's a new person. They are at 54,000 and they are an admin. Anybody see an issue here? Other than I don't have department.
Underscore between first name. Last
Yeah.
name.
Yeah. All of a sudden now, if I'm doing this and I were to call this on employee D, right? Let's say I had a program and I had to get all the first names. All of a sudden, there's an issue, right? Key name first name does not exist. And so if not only looking at this and saying, man, this is retyping a lot of the same things, if that doesn't already irk you, think about it from a way that we can protect our data input, right? So instead of having to do it this way, we see that there are some things that are similar, not some things, all things are similar between each employee, right? And so if I was doing this, if I was setting up my application, instead of doing it this way and just creating a dictionary for every single employee, which would be horrible to, think of naming conventions, think of just kind of retrieving that and keeping track of that employee. What's a way that we can basically create a blueprint for what we deem as an employee, right? An employee has 4 attributes. What is a blueprint we can do? And that's where OOP comes in. What it does is it allows us to compartmentalize our data instead of just putting it into a dictionary. It allows us to compartmentalize our data and assign different attributes or methods or decide what this data can do. So if we're working at some company and we are using OOP instead of using just some sort of dictionary, I'm going to create what we call a class. Now, if we're looking at this, classes are just a way that we can group and set a blueprint for my, in this case, employee. Now, obviously, it doesn't have to be an employee. You can use OOP with a lot of things. With a user, with a car is a really popular one. Let's say a burger, right? If you've got a blueprint of how something needs to be, that's where a class would come in. And we're going to see some more about what a class has with it. But let's go ahead and make my employee class. So let's go ahead. I want to make sure that I'm doing everything here. If I am making a class and moving forward, we're going to use a lot of classes. My first word I say is class. Now, in the same way I say def, if I want to create a function, if I want to create a class, I say class. And here I'm going to say employee. Now, you can do this right here. It's not going to yell at you, but if it takes in something, but for right now, you can also just leave it off and that would be okay. All right. So I have defined that I'm going to have a blueprint for my employee. All right. Something that's really important to note is with a class, we have got something called the init function. And that is something that is particular in Python. And that is a way that initializes, right, creates what we call an instance of my employee. So, and some of the stuff, as I first say it, might sound confusing, but we're gonna kind of walk and track and kind of explain some of it. So I'm gonna write some code real quick, and then once I write it, we're gonna talk about what is going on. Cool. Okay. So what this is doing, this is a double underscore. You might hear refer to it as a dunder, double underscore, dunder init. But this is what we call a magic method. Now it's a built-in kind of secret thing with Python, but it's just called a magic method. There's quite a few of them out there. Like when we do length, right? What length is actually calling is a dunder method in Python, but it's just a quicker way to say it. But what this is doing is this is initializing an instance of my employee. So let's say I wanted to create employee A, right? Well, first I have to have the blueprint for employee A. Now I'm going to write some more stuff and then I will talk through it. Oh, I didn't do H. Now, this init automatically runs when you call employee, when you are saying, I want to create an employee, this is the first method that it runs. And now if I'm looking, if I want to create an employee, well, it has a couple things, right? It needs a first name. I have to say what its first name is, the last name is, the salary, and the department. And that's what I'm doing here. Now, these are what we call attributes. I am setting and creating attributes of my employee. I'm creating the blueprint of my employee here. Thank you. This part is the attribute. And these parameters here are what we're going to pass in when we are creating our employee. It's going to make sense here in just a second. And then I'll explain this idea of this first, or self, sorry. But here I am saying, okay, I have got an attribute of self or of last name. I've got an attribute of first name. I'm going to create an attribute called self.salary. It's going to be equal to the salary that we pass in. And then I have self.department equal to the department. Perfect. Now, what this is doing is when this is running, you notice the first method or the first parameter, sorry, that is being called is this idea of self. What this is saying is this is connected to this specific instance of my employee. The name, a first name, I'm not saying every employee is now named John. I'm saying this specific employee that I'm creating, their name is John, right? This specific instance of my employee that I'm creating, their last name is Last, and so on and so forth. So the self is referencing this specific instance or this creation of my employee. Perfect. Then what I'm saying is I've got an attribute called first name, and it's going to be equal to the first argument being passed through. Now, one thing to note, these do not have to be the same. If this was FN, that would be fine, right? This can be unicorn. It doesn't matter. This is your attribute name. This is just you setting it to something. I can say upon creation, years at company, set it equal to 0, right? This is a default attribute. So whenever a employee is created, by default, they haven't worked for more than, they haven't worked at all. So their years at company is 0. Cool. Now, if I say something like this, employee A, oops. Employee. Now you see even my VS Code says, okay, for you to create an employee, there's 4 things that I need. I need a first name. So let's say John. Their last name, which we're going to say Dunder. John Dunder. Their salary, let's say 89,000. And their department is sales. If I were to run this code, let's talk about what's happening. I'm creating a variable called employee A. And when I do this, I call the class name. I'm just going to get rid of this code for right now. I call the class name. Here it's employee. I call that. This is saying I want to create a new instance of this class. Then I pass in the information that my class needs, right? It needs a first name, it needs a last name, it needs a salary, and it needs a department, right? These are just attributes, or sorry, these are just arguments that are being passed through, but I need to make sure that I pass those through. Then I'm saying, hey, that employee that I'm currently creating, their first name is equal to whatever I'm passing in right here. Their last name is equal to whatever I'm passing in right here. Salary is equal to, whatever is being passed in, and department is equal to whatever is being passed in here. One thing to note, the order of these must match the order of this. The order here does not have to match. This would work just fine. This is just calling on a bit of information. But because I haven't declared like, oh, this is, FN equals, because I haven't done that, I have to do this in a specific order. Now, it is normally what you do is you would do it like this, right? You wouldn't necessarily like say FN equals blank, last name equals blank. So just know that by default, Python is going to read this first one, and it's going to take whatever the first argument that you pass in through, and it's going to assign it to FN. This is just a variable name. Same thing with last name, salary, and sales. Cool.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
Can you just explain why 3 through 7 are necessary? Like, it seems to me when we're defining it originally in the parens, right, we create these, these terms that exist, self, FN, last name, etc. Why do we need 3 through 7? I'm not sure I'm clear there.
Yeah. So great question. These are the attributes, right? Remember I said I'm creating a blueprint of what my employee is going to have. Every employee in my database, in my company, is going to have a first name. Every employee is going to have a last name. They're going to have a department that they work at. They're going to have some sort of salary. And I've created that I want to keep track of how many years of the company. So maybe when they get to 5 years, I buy them a nice plaque, 10 years, whatever. So this is me creating the blueprint for every instance of my employee. Now it sounds kind of like, okay, well, you just created one. It would just be easier to create a dictionary. But this is when we're talking about object-oriented programming, we're doing this in a sense of how do we make and scale our application, right? Let's say I'm creating 1,000 employees each month, right? I work for Microsoft and people are coming and leaving and whatever. Now what I can do is I can just say employee YB is a instance of an employee. Here's Susan. They are Susan Gray. They make 110,000 and they are in management. So now, if I spell this correctly, I'm creating a new instance of my employee, but this employee, right? This instance still has a first name, still has a last name, still has a department, and still has a salary. So if I were to run this and say something like print employee dot first name, I do the same thing with employee B. Now I can actually access the attributes of that specific employee. So if I come here and I run my terminal, I say Python 3 main py, I get John and Susan. This is us laying down the blueprint for these instances of my employee class. Does that help clarify?
Sorry, it makes sense. I guess my question's equally though. It seems like what's in line 2 in the parentheses and what's in line 3 through 7 seems redundant. That's what that's kind of what I was thinking.
Great question. So this is me setting up what I should expect my employee to be. This is representing the arguments that are needed in order to create my employee. So these are just this guy right here. And this is the attributes of my employee. Now, what's important about that is, again, each employee has the same attributes, right? I can pass some stuff in upon creation, or I can create a default attribute where they by default have years at company. So this is me setting up, these are the attributes saying, okay, for an employee to exist, they have to have a first name, a last name, a department, a salary, and a years at company in order for them to even exist. This is okay when I am creating something, let's say in a real world perspective, let's say HR is creating your profile, right? They might fill out a form that has your first name, has your last name, might have your social security number, might have a way that they can pay you, whatever. When they're filling out that form, we're taking that information and we're creating a new instance of my employee, typically in my database. So now I have all the employees and they all have the same thing. So when we get to MySQL, the way we save stuff, right, in our models will be like, okay, what is the value at this key of first name? And so this is us preparing and setting up, laying the foundation for what does an employee need to have in order to exist.
Okay.
Does that make more sense?
The right-hand side of that. Yeah, the right-hand side of it, like FN, last name, etc., has to match what's in the parentheses above, right? Otherwise, it's not going to know to connect to them. Okay.
Yeah. And these just represent this right here, right? This can be unicorn. Doesn't matter. Where this could be unicorn. This is just saying, hey, I'm also going to pass in some values. And then let's go ahead and make those attributes equal to whatever values I passed in.
What if like something's different between them? Like what if say like just say in this instance, like there are certain people that are in sales and they get bonuses, but other people don't. So it wouldn't be like the same attribute for all of them.
Yeah. So maybe one thing we could do is in department, I could have which we'll get to with the methods. And I can check and say, well, hey, if self.department equals sales, then run the give bonus method. And I give them a bonus. So my employees still have that, but I can now use this information to say like, oh, if I want all of my HR people, right? I can use this in my database. And that's where it really will come in handy is I can use this to get all of my HR people, right? They still have a first name, a last name, a department, and how much they make, but we can filter by one of those attributes in this case, which would be HR.
Okay.
And that's something we're going to get to even further. So you might have, so that's called like inheritance. So that's what we're going to talk about on Wednesday, which I love where your head's kind of going. And so where I can have a class of employee, but then I can have another class called sales employee that gets all this information on top of maybe they have different methods called like a get a bonus or things that are unique to just a salesman that the HR don't have or saleswoman, salesperson. Okay. So we've talked about this init. This automatically runs. When we say this employee, right? And we do these parentheses, we are creating a new instance of our employee class. That starts this instead of like a function call, right? Usually when a function runs, we have to call it first. This is automatically calling this init function. That is creating a new instance of employee. So creating a new person, right? A new employee. And we're saying, okay, we want to create this new employee. I want to set their first name equal to whatever I just passed through. In this case, John, right? At FN. Their last name is equal to Dunder. Their salary is equal to 89,000 and their department is they are in sales. They're still an employee, right? They're a human being. They just have different information, but they have all the same attributes, a first name, a last name, department, a salary, and a years at company. How are we feeling on this? Guys, put a 1 if this makes sense. Put a 0.5 if you're kind of confused, and put a 0 if you're like, I have zero idea what's happening. Lots of 1s. Okay, perfect. Okay. Cool. Now, something I want to point out is right now I'm in my class employee. Now, Python is great because it has very few rules, but Python can suck because it has very few rules, right? And so what I can say is something like this. Employee A dot, let's say salary equals 100,000, that's 10,000. Right? And then I print, so let's say print employee A dot salary. I actually want to do this twice because I want this to come up here. So if I were to run this, I don't need this anymore. You see that it says 89,000. Then they got a nice little $11,000 bump to 100,000. But this is not standard. This is not how you would change something of a of an instance of your employee. This can get scary because what if I do something like this, right? And let's say they got a promotion, and then I have an intern in my HR department, and they accidentally put $10,000. Nobody catches it, and then now all of a sudden their next check they're making 1/10 of what they are thinking that they're going to make, right? Literally 1/10. So what we would do typically, instead of changing an attribute of an instance like this, that's where we would create a method, right? So we've talked about the attributes. We've talked about how to get the attributes. We just use the dot notation. So what I say is the employee, which is right here, my variable, which represents this instance, this object, right? And then I just say dot salary that gets me their attribute. We've talked about that information. We'll talk about class attributes here in just a second. We talked about passing these. But if I were to, let's say that I wanted to like give a promotion, then what I would do instead of doing something like this, instead of saying, you know, employee A salary equals some new number, what I would actually do is I would create a method within my class. Let's call it def get raise or raise. Salary raise. Now, anytime you are creating a method within a class, it has to take in self. If it's a, we're going to talk about the two other types of methods, but this is what we call an instance method, right? This is something that every salary or every employee can have, but this is specific to an employee instance. Then here I create this method. And here's where I would say something like this. Self dot salary equals I would probably say plus equals num. Oh, nope. Equals num. So if I wanted to change their salary to 100,000, what I would do is I would actually create a method. Now you might ask yourself, what the heck is a method versus a function, right? I might use them interchangeably a couple times. A method is a function that is associated with a class. So I might say like a class function or class method. Just know that if a function is associated with a class, it's referred to as a class method or a method. So here I have this method called salary raise that takes in some number. So if I wanted to change this, instead of doing something like this, what I could do is I could say employee A dot. Now you can see I have access to their different attributes, but I also have access to this right here, this salary raise. Now, in order for me to call it just kind of like a function, I have to do this, right? I have to do my parentheses, but you can also see that it is taking in some number. So here I'm going to put 100,000. And that's it. And I save my code and it should look like this. So this is called a method, right? That affects this specific instance of my employee. In this case, employee A represents the instance, right? The entire instance of my employee. Then I run this method and I pass it the number to where this is what changes the salary of my employee A to whatever number I pass through, in this case, 100,000. Any questions on methods to start? Do methods make sense? Yeah, put a 1 if that makes sense. Put a 0 if it does not make sense. Okay. Couple people put 1s. Are the other people still confused, or are you not by your computers? Cool. Cool. Lots of 1s.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, go
I'll ask a
ahead.
question. That's okay. Can you go back to the code for a sec?
Yeah.
Can you just connect the dot on why? I guess what I hear you saying is that the method's applying to A, specifically employee A in this case. Can you just connect the dot on why it's connecting to employee A, given the fact that employee A is below, right? You define the method above there in line 9.
Yeah.
Can it apply to any employee as a result of that?
Yep, absolutely. So here, the reason it applies to employee A is because when I created employee A, I have access, and it's of type class. I have access to everything within this class. Anything that any employee can do, right? Let's say I were to have another one called def work birthday. That takes in self. And then all I say is self dot years at company plus equals 1. That's it. This is a method that is accessible by any instance of my employee. Any instance of my employee. So any employee can access salary raise. Any employee has access to work birthday, any single one of them. And so by me doing this, employee A just represents this instance that was created by this employee or by this line of code, right? So employee A holds that, represents that instance. And so what's happening here is I'm saying, okay, employee A, I run salary raise. Now, when it comes, and then I pass it this 100,000. When it comes to here, this self is really important because it's the way that I distinguish. I only want to change employee A. It only refers to this employee right here. Whatever employee is calling the method, that's who it changes. That's why this self.salary, it's not changing the salary for every single employee, just the one that we're calling salary raise to. So that's what the self is. It allows us to narrow down our instance that we are talking about of our employee and just change that instance's salary, not all of them. So that's what self is doing here. Does that make more sense?
Yep. Good.
So this instance has access to do that. So let's say a year later happens and I say employee A dot work birthday. I don't have to pass in anything, but I do have to call it because it's a method. And then I say print employee A dot years at company. Or to run this. Now you're going to see 1, right? And if I were to do this again, should see 1, then 2. Because this specific employee A, this method has run twice. So we changed the first time. It starts at 0 when it was created. The years worked was 0, the years at company. Then their first work birthday happened. We said, okay, this specific employee has been here for a year. So let's go ahead and change that years at company to 1. Then another year happened. We change it now to 2. And so if I print it, that's where we get this 2 from right here. Does that make sense?
So it means that if an employee has worked 30 years, we need to change and write this code 30 times.
So this would be like from the perspective of if they were just created and let's say, right, like you would, so let's see. So if we're setting this up, we're setting it up from the beginning, right? What we could do is something like, if I were to say that, let's say somebody were to come and I was setting up for like existing employees. I would say employee, let's say Danica, push. They make 200 because they've been there forever. That's 2,200. They are an engineer. And then if I say years, no, at company. If we wanted to, we would do something like this. If we were to do something like that, then I would say years at company. Let's say we're creating new employees, then by default, what I could do is set up a default value, right? So if they don't pass years at company, like I didn't here, then it's just going to imply that it's 0. But if I were to say something like this, 30, right? And then I want to print employee C dot years at company. If I were to do this, let's clear and then run my code, you get 30. So if you wanted to set it up that way, you totally could. You can set it up to where years at company by default starts at 0. But if I wanted to, I could pass in the value.
So in this instance, at the top where we are saying years at company equals to 0, it's not exactly matching with the self dot year at companies is equal to years at company. We are not putting in row 7, right?
Yeah, no, we are though, right? Remember, in a function, we can pass in a default value, meaning if it's not given to us, this is what I want it to represent. So here, this years at company works the same way salary works, right? If my user inputs that, right, here they did it 30. Well, then the value for years at company here is 30. If they don't put that, right, like here they didn't put that, then by having this default parameter saying, well, if nothing's inputted there, just go ahead and set it equal to 0. So for this employee A, their years at company, because they didn't pass anything, starts at 0. Danica, on the other hand, she's an OG, been there for 30.
All I was saying that in row 7,
Uh-huh.
where it is equal to years at company, right?
Mhm.
We are not exactly putting equal to 0 also here.
Oh, no, this is just going to be equal to this value up here that is either 0 if they didn't put anything or whatever the
Okay.
user puts after that. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yep.
John, you had your hand raised or you had a question?
Yeah, I was just curious as to why why we don't put any of the number values in quotations.
Because they're integers. If I put it in a quotation, then it will read it as a string.
Okay.
Remember, Python interprets.
Yep.
So by doing no strings, then this is to say like, oh, this is of type integer. If I were to put it in a string, then all of a sudden it will just, or put it in quotations, it'll read it as a string. And then I lose any functionality I want on, let's say like this guy right here, right? When I'm saying plus equals 1, that's something an integer can do. And it'll say like, I can't add a string to an integer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great question though. Yeah, great question. Good clarification. Cool. So we've talked about our class. We've talked about our init. And this is something that it might seem a little muddy now. We're going to continue to clarify on Wednesday. But this is something that as you start creating stuff, you say, okay, well, what are the attributes? Okay, I know I need to pass those through. And as you start doing this, you will become more comfortable with it. And especially by the time we get to like Flask plus MySQL, you'll absolutely have plenty of time kind of working through that. But there's a couple more things that I wanted to kind of go through just to make sure that we knew kind of what's going on. Now, if one thing I do want to point out is if you have experience in another language, right? If you don't, then kind of don't worry about what I'm about to say. But you can kind of think about this as our constructor, right? And like Java, you have to have a constructor. This init acts the same way. If you guys are moving to Java, you'll learn about constructors. But that is what this init acts like. We've talked about our attributes. We've talked about how to reference to instance information in the sense of work or .salary, right? We've talked about how do we create an instance of a class. Did that here. Again, we've talked about how self is a passage of just information for this specific instance, right? So this employee A, just that employee has this information. It is not something that is spread across all employees, right? It's just this instance. And that's because we have access to this self right here. We've talked about functions versus methods and basically how a method is just a function associated with a class, but they operate the same way. When we are specifically talking about instances of a class, we use the self. Now, I do want you to be aware of, and we'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday about this. There are two other types of methods. They're called class and static. What class is, and I'm just going to briefly talk about them, but then we'll talk a little bit more and show you some examples. And it's going to become really clear when we get to the Python MySQL stuff. The class method is not associated with that specific, with any specific instance, but the class in its entirety. In this case, you can see a class method would be, let's say we had a bank name, right? I'm just changing the bank name. I'm not changing, a specific account or anything like that. That's where we have a class method. It is only associated with the actual class. Then there's a static method, and this is something that you won't really see in Python a ton. We want you to be aware of it because if you are working with any other languages past this, whether it be JavaScript or more like Java or C#, Rust, any of those kind of more strictly typed, we kind of just wanted you to be aware of what a static method is. What a static method is it has, really nothing to do with the class or the instance in itself. So with a class, instead of self, we say CLS. That just kind of represents the same thing. It's this specific class that we're dealing with. With a static method, it is just a random function, basically, that your class has, but it doesn't have to do anything with this specific class or with, a specific instance. So in this case, like can withdraw, all this is a function that takes in two values, right? And then either says return true or false. And maybe we might call this on an actual instance, but static is not something we will really use too much in this entire course. But we wanted you to be aware of this because if you do work with any sort of other languages, static methods are there. So, but again, we're going to talk about that and give some more examples for class methods in our next class. My focus now is just to make sure that you guys really understand methods, you understand attributes. Now, one thing I do want to point out is these are attributes, right, for my employee. But let's say I wanted to have a class attribute, right? I've got a company. Let's say I work at Dojo Pizza. We're an empire of pizza. Not really pizza. I'm getting told it's giving me heartburn. Let's say Dojo. What's a good food? Anybody have a favorite food?
I don't know if you can hear me. Tacos.
Tacos. All right. I love tacos. So let's say I'm creating an employee, right? But my employee, everybody works at Dojo's Tacos. What I can do is I can create a class attribute that says company name equals Dojo's Tacos. This right here is not associated with a specific instance, right? In the sense of we don't have to change this name. This name is not being inputted with each instance, but every instance is part of the Dojo's Tacos, right? This is the company everybody works for. This is what we call a class attribute, right? Here's the company that all the employees work for. Class attribute, and this is an instance attribute. So I can do that, right? I can say something like, instead of years at company, let's say company name. They still have access to it because it is on the class. It's within the class, right? I still have access to it. So if I were to run this and say new terminal. Nope. Here I have Dojo's Tacos, but I didn't input that or do, it's not unique to each instance. Every instance of my class employee has an attribute called company name of Dojo's Tacos. And that's where that kind of class method could come in. So let's say I was doing something like class method that said def name change takes in CLS and it takes in name. Where then I would say something like company name equals name. So if I were to do this, then all of a sudden it would change, right? If we do this correctly, changing the name. Speak of Dojo. So let's see. Let's say coding calzones. And then I were to do this. Oh, I got an error. String object is not callable. Go ahead.
I think you need to just put CLS dot company name, if I'm not wrong, in the class function or the class
Oh,
method.
right here.
Well, up top. up at
Oh,
line like
yeah, you're
18
right.
or-
Sorry. Thank you. Instead of saying self. So instead of saying self, good catch. Instead of saying self, you say CLS dot company name. And this is referring to the class attribute of company name. Good catch right there. Thank you. I was like, what is happening? Now, if I were to run this, I still get in there.
Yeah, you have to run the actual function rather than just referring to the class. I think that's what it is. Right, it was change name or something, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, name change. That's why I
Yeah,
was.
so rather, yeah, employee dot name change, yeah, would be correct.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought my method was called company name. My bad. Híjole. Name change. I even passed the information. Like I knew what I was doing.
Only reason is because I literally just did this like
Yeah.
an hour ago. So
Yeah, there we go. So we had, sorry, yeah, I don't know why I called it company name. I was trying to refer to the method. I don't know why I called the actual attribute. But here, because I have this class method, right? I can affect this class attribute. This class method is called name change. Instead of taking in self, it takes in CLS, the name we want to change it to. And then if I want to refer to this class, I say CLS dot company name. This is my class attribute in itself. And then I just make it my new name. And by this CLS, it goes, oh, employee, right? Okay, so I'm working with the employee class. This class has company name here. Any questions on this stuff?
Yeah, I have a question. I was thinking, where does the private, public, and protected topics comes here? Are we going to cover that later?
That is not a thing in Python. Unfortunately, like the private,
Oh,
the
no.
public, and the like for in the sense of like Java doesn't really work that way in Python.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because while I was looking to the video in the platform, right in here, it was talking about the private, public, and so I was a little confused in the
Nope, so-
platform. The first
Yeah.
video.
Yeah, he's right. In the platform, there's a video that talks about private, public, and protection or something like that.
Where is that at?
In the very first video of Python, OOP.
OOP, yeah.
check the link.
Yep, here.
I think he's just referring to like general ideas of OOP.
Yeah.
And yeah,
What if you wanted to give it a?
Oh, right here. Yeah. So that would be so in OOP, if you're working with something like a Java or like a C#, you can have what we call private, protected, and public, right? Attributes. So where what it does is it basically allows you to decide what has access to my attributes or what can change it. So if it's private, then people can't see it. Python doesn't work that way. Python doesn't have that information. Now there's some workarounds if you wanted to really do that, but it's not something that Python does. This is how and that's one of transparently, that's one of the like downfalls of Python, sorry, is that it doesn't have access to that, or it doesn't have those. And so you can kind of like, remember when I changed the salary to Like I just all of a sudden said employee A salary equals 10,000. Well, if I wanted to make sure that nobody could change that unless somebody had access to it, then I could make that a private, right? But Python doesn't allow that. It's pretty free, right? You can do a lot of stuff, but with that can come some, issues. And that's why we want to make sure that we, instead of changing something specifically, we always do a method that does what we need it to do. But yeah, no, it doesn't. Great question. Sorry about that video. That is confusing, but there is no public, private, or protected within Python. But it's
Awesome.
big if you go
Thank
to Java or strictly type language. That's how it works.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. It just is about accessibility, like, what are you allowed to use and what are you allowed to do? And see. Any other questions, my friends? Kevin asks, so each instance now reflects the change, the class attribute? Yeah, great question. So now each instance has, so if I were to do something like this, B, nope, B, and then I were to do something like this, now we're to run this. Because I did this class method, it applies to every instance of this class. Every instance inherits this attribute. And because we changed it, now B also gets it. Great question, Kevin. Really good question. And thanks for answering that,
I have a
Peter.
quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting though, for this going up to line 19. So anytime you want to change a class method, it just sits on top of it like that. There's no semicolon after it. You just declare it and then drop below and put the rest of the detail. It doesn't have to be in the same line or anything like that.
Yeah, this is just declaring that this is a class method. It's called a decorator.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Mhm. Yeah. And so you would do, so with a normal one, right? No, normal one, sorry. When you're dealing with an instance, you don't have to put any sort of decorator, right? But when you are dealing with a class or a static method, it operates the same way as well. To where if I go to static method, if I want to change it, I also put static method. That's a decorator.
Got it.
How
Thank
about
you.
how about if you put all the way at the top before, like right now we have put next to the instances, right? That's why we are declaring it. How about if we put it all the way at the top? Then even on that case, we need to say add class method.
Yes.
Like after we have, how about if you put it under row 2? The same
Under-
function.
Are you-
Under-
You're saying if I put this entire thing under line 2? Yes.
Yeah, and still we need to say add class method.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a decorator. There's some built-in functionality from Python that that by doing this decorator, it acts in a different way.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And it allows us to actually pass an entire class right here versus any sort of like self. Now, to note, you might see in the wild of development, you might see this as S, right, instead of self. But it is absolutely convention that you use self right here. So just stick with self. Any other questions, my friends? Talked a lot about OOP today. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about kind of more theory next week, or sorry, on Wednesday when we talk about the 4 pillars of OOP, but we're going to also talk about how can now 2 different classes interact with one another. Any other questions for you, my friends? Does this stuff make sense? Thanks, Kevin. Well, cool. If there's nothing else, then I will see you guys on Wednesday. Again, I will be doing a kind of breakout session next office hour, and I'm going to walk through some of those functions intermediate and maybe see if I can dig up some other ones that we can walk through, and maybe I'll see if I can create some for you guys just as practice of functions, because I get it. It can be really hard at the beginning. So I will absolutely. And so on Wednesday, next office hour, I'll make sure that I do the functions intermediate one and just some of those more questions. Other than that, friends, I hope you guys have a wonderful night.